But on this one, it seems at least there's going to be a federal investigation. And there are a lot of people, including myself, who are dubious of the willingness of this DOJ to do a fair investigation. And so the question becomes, could the state take action?
We're watching a lot of the rules that I thought were very familiar get shredded right now, and that's why we need some responsibility.
The legal question now is, okay, we've seen the videos, we've seen the response. What can happen now? A lot of you were calling in asking this question yesterday, both in terms of the criminal law and also civil law, meaning, the potential for money damages. Now, unlike the investigation with Renee Good, which sounds like it's not going to be an investigation at all, right? I mean, they've already determined that there's nothing there. On this one, they tried to do the same thing. They tried to tell us that there's nothing there. Alex Peretti was coming at the officers, and then the videos came out, right? And the videos here are seemingly more unambiguous than the ones with Renee Good. Meaning, despite in the Renee Good case, the violations of basic protocol by police, et cetera, there are arguments that to be made about the way she turned her car into him and what a reasonable officer in his position would think, et cetera. Here, it's tough to think about what the defenses would be, right? We thought he was reaching for his gun. Okay, that's still not in the situation that they were in with 6 officers on top of him. You'd probably need more than just we thought he was reaching, because again, the video evidence indicates that he was actually disarmed before the first shot was fired. So all of the video is terrible. But on this one, it seems at least there's going to be a federal investigation. This is the president on the White House lawn today. This is number 4.
But we're doing a big investigation. I want to see the investigation. I'm going to be watching over it. I want a very honorable and honest investigation. I have to see it myself.
I assume he's talking about the federal investigation there, right? And there are a lot of people, including myself, who are dubious of the willingness of this DOJ to do a fair investigation. And so the question becomes, could the state take action? And there's an opinion piece in the New York Times today written by Professor Barry Friedman and Professor Stephen Vladeck, which says the following: despite the incredulity with which some legal observers meet the idea, state and local prosecutors can prosecute federal officials for violating state criminal laws. Prosecutors should be gathering and securing evidence and seriously considering filing charges. So joining us now is Barry Friedman, one of the co-authors of the article, professor of law and faculty director of the Policing Project at New York University Law School. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Good to be here.
All right. So first, let's start with what the president has said, that there's going to be an investigation here. Do you presume, as I do, that he is talking about a federal investigation, not a state one?
He's certainly talking about a federal investigation. There's no doubt about that.
All right. And I would presume that you, like me, think there is little chance that a federal investigation is going to determine that charges should be brought against any officers.
Yeah, if you look already, there are irregularities about what's happening here. Ideally, in a situation like this, either the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department or the FBI would be investigating, but I understand that neither of those two things is happening. So absent that, yes, I'm not sure I would have believed it anyway, but I have no reason to believe that there'll be a federal criminal charges. Okay.
So let's start with that presumption, because I agree with you on that. This is where it gets interesting, is this is what your op-ed piece is about. Local prosecution is the answer to federal lawlessness. Talk to us about how that could work.
Sure. Some people think this is remarkable or unusual, and J.D. Vance said the same. But the truth is, for hundreds of years, this has been the case, that state officials can investigate federal law enforcement officers for violating state law. It's not a big deal. There are special rules that apply. For example, the case, at least initially, gets moved to a federal court. But state prosecutors have always had this authority. And what Steve and I are arguing is it's not just in these high-profile murders. We're seeing video after video of arguably federal officials violating constitutional rights in a way that also violates state law, so they should just bring prosecutions.
So explain to us how that works, right? You mentioned that it could be moved to federal court. I think when most people think of it moving to federal court, they think of federal law applying. Talk to us about how that would work.
Yeah, no, that's not the way it works. And you know, tiny divergence, but I think will be interesting to people. There's a famous case from the 1870s where a federal revenue agent went to grab a still in Tennessee, an illegal still, and ended up shooting the owner of the still, and they brought charges against him. Case called Tennessee versus Davis. And what they do is, under a federal statute, when a federal official's been sued in state court, they move it to federal court. The federal officer can move it to federal court. But it's still the state prosecutor. It's still state law. It just changes the judge and the jury. And that's how it goes, so long as there's a possibility that the federal official has a federal defense. We could talk about that. If there's no federal defense, it gets sent back to state court for a regular criminal prosecution. And if there is a federal defense, then it gets litigated in federal court, whether there's been a state crime and whether there's something in federal law that excuses the commission of that state crime.
Yeah, let's talk about the federal defense here. Because, look, while it's true that theoretically and practically this can happen, there are additional hurdles, are there not, when a state prosecutor is trying to prosecute a federal officer?
Sure, there are hurdles, and we could wind our way through all of them, but I actually think I can bring you to a pretty simple bottom line, which is that when state officials prosecute a federal officer for violating state law, the federal officer can defend, and they have to show two things. First, that what they did was in the course of their federal duties. Here, you know, I think we can accept that they were engaging in federal duties. The second, though, is the critical one, which was, would a reasonable officer have thought that the actions that they took were reasonable and necessary, or necessary and appropriate to what happened? And that's where the rub's going to be in these cases.
And that sounds like it is very much the same standard that is applied to police officers around the country when dealing with cases of excessive force.
Yes, it's very similar, for example, to what you've probably heard of as qualified immunity. It's not clear that it's precisely the same, but it does ask the same general question, which is, look, what the officers did they have to do it? Was it part of what they needed to get the situation under control? And Dan, if I could just make one point, because I know everybody's focused on the Renee Good and the Alex Preddy situations, and we should be. But if you're watching the videos, there are federal officers bursting into people's homes on I think, an unconstitutional memorandum saying they don't need judicial warrants. All of those are invalid. Like, I don't think there's any federal defense there. I don't think there's a federal defense to some of the roughness that I've seen on television. And so, you know, we should focus on these cases, but we should look more broadly, because the only way you're going to deter this federal conduct is if these officers know that they could be sued criminally in state court.
Well, I want to talk about the lawsuits in a moment, because so far we've been just talking about the criminal side. I was talking to Professor Barry Friedman from New York University Law School. You know, we heard from J.D. Vance, he called it, you know, absolute immunity, or Stephen Miller did, one of the two or both of them. And there is something called the supremacy clause. And that is something that has come up, particularly from conservatives and those on the right who want to basically suggest that you can't, federal law is supreme over state law. And as a result, how can a state prosecutor bring a case against a federal officer? Explain that to us.
Yeah, you know, actually, this whole supremacy immunity isn't actually real. It's two separate things that are getting tangled up. The federal Constitution has something called the Supremacy Clause, and all that says is that in state courts, federal law applies. But there's something else called intergovernmental immunity, which says that the two governments, the state and the federal, don't interfere with each other. They go about their own business, and the other jurisdiction just doesn't get in the way. And that's what people are really referring to. It's not an absolute immunity. I've told you the rules, which is if a federal officer is in the state of Minnesota or Michigan or you name it, and they violate state law, then they can be prosecuted. I mean, let me give you just a hypothetical and a real case. Case called Mesa versus California. Postal workers negligently driving a postal truck down the sidewalk and injure somebody. Well, nobody's going to defend driving a postal truck down the sidewalk, and so the criminal prosecution goes forward. Imagine that one of these ICE officials or Customs and Border officials had, been accused of robbing banks or raping somebody in the state. Nobody's going to say that's within their federal responsibilities, even if they're within a federal law. So that's the question in each case, is what you were doing necessary to your federal responsibilities? It doesn't matter what badge you have on. It matters what you were doing.
And you guys mentioned now let's talk about civil, about the possibility of lawsuits that could occur here. In this article in the New York Times entitled "Local Prosecution is the Answer to Federal Lawlessness" that was published today, you say, what's more, a series of decisions by the Supreme Court has made it all but impossible to hold federal officers liable for damages in federal lawsuits for violating our constitutional rights. So when it comes to suing for civil damages, no way they're going to be able to win in federal court?
It's really tough to win these civil damage cases. And the Supreme Court, in part, is in fault here because they've made it so tough. Congress also could step in and pass a way for people to sue under civil damages. There are a lot of immunities. It's actually interesting, Dan. Some of the largest critics to that body of law that immunizes state and federal officers are conservative judges who've written and said, look, this isn't in the Constitution. It's outrageous. You can't deter wrongful conduct unless you can hold people responsible. But that's what Steve and I are saying, is precisely because it's so hard to get a federal criminal prosecution and so hard to get a state civil prosecution or federal civil prosecution, we need state and local prosecutors to step up and do their job.
Can there be a state civil lawsuit brought?
Yes, that's slightly more complicated, but yes, there are different vehicles to do that, including some states like California have passed laws that basically take the civil rights statute that's in federal law for state officials and passed a state version for federal officials. And there's been some dispute about whether that's acceptable or not, but I don't see any problem with it. I mean, if federal officials are violating the Constitution, I don't know why it would be remarkable to hold them responsible. Again, as you pointed out, they may have special federal immunities. It may be because of their federal responsibilities. We don't want state and local prosecutors or anybody else going after them all the time. But in these outrageous cases where they're clearly violating constitutional rights, why would we not want to bring a stop to that?
All right. Now, I didn't hear what he said, but I want to play this. This is Governor Josh Shapiro, who's been on this show, is also an attorney from Pennsylvania. He was on, this is number 14, he was on CBS's Late Show last night, and I think he was talking about this very question. Let's listen.
Initially, the vice president said, after the death of Renee Good at the hands of an ICE agent, said that these ICE agents enjoy absolute immunity from prosecution by Minnesota officials. You were Attorney General of Pennsylvania. Can the state prosecute an ICE agent or a CBP agent who does this sort of thing?
Yes. And what the vice president, who, by the way, I mean, such a sycophant, such a suck-up. He embarrasses himself daily as he seeks the affirmation of Donald Trump. He is wrong when he says they have immunity, whether in Mr. Preddy's case or in Miss Good's case. And by the way, I will just tell you, as a former attorney general, based only on the available evidence that I've seen, that you've seen, I'm not privy to anything else. I think you could make a very strong case for voluntary manslaughter charges to be brought in the Preddy case. And I would also argue you could, at the very least, bring obstruction of justice charges in both cases. These federal agents are obstructing a state investigation. They have messed with a crime scene. They have made clear that they would be withholding evidence. What they are doing is dangerous. They are not above the law. No one is above the law in this country, and no one has absolute immunity. I don't care what kind of BS J.D. Vance spews.
But Professor Barry Friedman, as of right now, they're not even releasing the name of the agent or the names of who the other agents were who were at that scene. And in fact, all we know is that they've been moved out of the state. How would they go about forcing the disclosure of who was involved?
Well, there are a couple of answers to that question. I mean, one of them is that if and when the state files its charges in state court, and there may well be enough evidence to do that just based on what we've frankly seen on television, then they have subpoena power and they can subpoena whatever evidence that they need. The other is, it's been a little interesting to me to watch what's gone on with these ICE raids. I wrote an op-ed a while ago about the masking that we're seeing, but facial recognition is perfectly capable of identifying many people, even with the mask on. You might have noticed that with your phone in the winter when you have a scarf on or something. And so, they can find out who it is. That does not seem to me to be nearly the most difficult part of this. By the way, sorry, I was just also going to say, sometimes there are also, Jane and John Doe lawsuits that are filed where somebody's, identified that way unless and until we know who it is.
Yeah, I just wonder, though, so don't we get into these same fights about state versus federal with the subpoenas, right? So they subpoena the feds, right? The feds fight back and say they're not entitled to this information. We're doing our own investigation. I would think at the least they would argue we're not going to release anything about an ongoing investigation until this investigation is concluded. Any of that hold any weight?
Yeah, I guess I want to separate out two things. One is what our time horizon is here, and the other is how the federal officials are going to behave. So, you're focused, as I understand that you would be, on the right now. What's going to happen right now with these folks in office? But there's a beyond the right now, which is that you could still file these cases and hope that sometime there won't be these same folks in office, and you can move forward. There are lots of times in history where, Nuremberg is one that comes to mind easily, where after the fact, when there's been a change of who's in power, there are lawsuits brought and there are prosecutions. And so I don't think we should and the state should keep fighting right now. But I think that what's really essential is to stop what's going on in the streets that we see. And to do that, state and local officials need to just move forward and see what happens.
But they would also, there's also the possibility the president could pardon them. That would protect them from federal charges.
Only federal.
Only federal. Let's go to Wayne in California. Wayne, how you doing? What do you got?
Good, Dan. How are you?
Good. What's going on?
Thank you. I love your show. Love your media.
Thank you.
Okay, give me a minute to articulate this. I don't want to sound politically extreme. 20 or 30 Americans were killed by illegal criminals during the previous administration. One side of the country cared and one side of the country didn't care, mostly probably because of the media. Now, even though I'm a Trump supporter, a lot of Americans are suffering and some now being killed because of what I see as irresponsible federal government in one way or another, overreach or whatever the right word is. So I like for you to nuance that for me.
Sure. It's actually an easy one, Wayne. The difference is one of them is government action and the other isn't. When we're talking about what the administration is doing or what federal officials are doing, there is an enormous obligation when you have the power of the government behind you that is fundamentally different than saying, oh, there were these illegal bad guys and the liberal media didn't care about it. Now, if you want to talk about it from a media perspective, that's a separate issue, right? The fact that I think that the right overcovers people who are here illegally engaged in crimes, and I think the left undercovers it. Okay, fair enough. But that has nothing to do with the government abusing its power. Remember, our whole Bill of Rights was written to prevent the government from overreach. That's what it is. So there is no comparison, Wayne. I hear your point, but to me, there's not even a nuance here. Let's go to Ash in Arkansas. Ash, how you doing? What do you got?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
I'd rather not make these conversations, but are you there?
I'm here. I hear you.
Okay. I'm a middle of the road guy. What I would like to know is I thought I knew what comply and probable cause is. Now watching these agents, I don't know what they are because you got to instruct somebody and then give them a chance to do it. Am I wrong? Am I not now knowing what comply even means anymore?
Professor Barry Friedman.
Yeah, Dan and Ash, I think what we're seeing on television has really been eye-opening to a lot of people, literally. It's like the story about the emperor's new clothes, which is you think the government's going to do good. You may agree or disagree, but when you start to watch what's happening, you think that can't really be what the Constitution allows. Or if I may say so, because I run something called the Policing Project, that can't really be what good policing looks like. And I've heard from a lot of police, and we've heard on television from a lot of police officials who would be the first to say that's not what good policing looks like, that you request compliance, that you don't rough people up, that you don't go busting into people's vehicles or homes without reasonable suspicion or probable cause, depending upon what exactly you're doing. And so, Ash, I think you're exactly right that we're watching a lot of the rules that I thought were very familiar get shredded right now. And that's why we need some responsibility.
Well, Professor Friedman, just so you know, yesterday on the show, my entire monologue at the beginning was about how I think that what is happening here in the response of the administration is terrible for cops across the country, because it undermines, because I'm very pro law enforcement. I believe very often that people immediately want criminal charges against cops anytime there's an officer involved shooting, and that there are legal standards and there are nuances, and I want to wait until the investigations come through, et cetera. And this is the exact opposite. This is exactly what the right yells at the left about, which is you're prejudging the facts without even knowing. And here, well, they prejudged, but then we have the videos which belied it all. Ash, thank you. Let's go to South Carolina and Tom. Tom, how you doing? What do you got?
Hey, Dan. So one thing that I wanted to take the whole video and just go up to before he was shot. And let's just say he was never shot. They have 4 guys on him everybody's holding an arm and a leg. They pepper sprayed him. And then there's a guy in the front with a spray bottle canister bashing him in the face 3 times. So let's just say it ended there. Would that have been acceptable? Like, would that have done, like, is that, of course not. They're allowed to do that?
Of course not. It just wouldn't have gotten the sort of attention that this is getting, because you hear the gunshots and you hear 10 gunshots. But look, we've seen, and this is the point Professor Friedman was making a moment ago, that there have been incidents across the country of what you're talking about, which is abuse by ICE that doesn't seem to be leading to any accountability. And ought to. And again, I'm going to repeat what I said yesterday. The worst thing for good cops is bad cops, okay? Any good cop will tell you the worst thing for them is bad cops. And that means you got to hold the bad cops accountable. You got to hold the ones who completely and clearly cross the line accountable. Let's go to Maine and Doug. Doug, what do you got?
Good afternoon, Dan. Dan, first of all, I just want to say that I recognize that both sides, both parties over history, people do wrong things and so forth. But in this time frame, I'm just totally blown away in that going back to the Renee Good videos that I've watched, and I've watched the most recent ones too that happened, and the lies that are coming out blatant that are belied. How can any of us believe in anything that the government is currently doing? To me, Dan, the worst thing in the modern history, so to speak, would be back to the 60s when we had in the South and the civil rights movements, police and so forth doing these same types of things. Other than that, who are we as a nation, and why should we believe anything? Dan, I'm retired now, but I taught American government for 20 years. I'm not an attorney or anything like that, but I've got a little bit of knowledge in that time. And I, honest to goodness, don't know how I would teach if I were doing it today. I can't believe it. I'm just totally frustrated and worried about our country.
You bring up an interesting point that I want to discuss with Professor Barry Friedman, which is that typically the federal government is the ones that check on the state government, right? I mean, typically the way it works is if the state isn't doing enough to hold people accountable, the feds can step in, right? Sometimes we see both. But here you have the reverse, which I've never really seen before, which is the state saying that the feds aren't doing enough or are, in this case, committing crimes that aren't leading to accountability.
Yeah. Dan, if I may
let me let Professor Friedman talk about it for a second.
Yeah, I mean, people have asked me about this a lot because, one of the worries about these state prosecutions is you don't want to tie down federal officials. If you think back, for example, to the civil rights movement, where the federal officials are coming in doing the right thing. But the people who wrote the Constitution were actually way more afraid of the federal government than they were of the state governments, and they thought the state governments would be a way to push back. We've been relatively fortunate in this country that we haven't had to rely on that. But I It's like your last caller pointed out. People are seeing things now on the video that they know can't possibly be right. We all know it can't possibly be right. And that's the time for state and local prosecutors to step up.
Let's go to Ohio and Joe. Joe, how you doing? What's going on?
Thank good, Dan. Hey, I'm a Trump guy, but everything he does isn't right, and that's a bad luck up in Minnesota. But having said that, and that's terrible tragedy. But a couple things I've always heard from the left and everybody else, even Shapiro, your clip said, no one's above the law. No one's above the law. Trump's not above the law. Well, our law says if you're an illegal immigrant, whether you're a good person, not a good person, been here 5 minutes, 5 years, you shouldn't be in our country and you should be deported. Yet everybody wants to say, well, the good people, they should be able to stay. Well, then change our laws and create asylum. And I don't think it's really legal for people to obstruct ICE operations that are lawful and throw snowballs, stones, shoot bottle rockets, fireworks at them, and all that stuff. So, yeah, I get, if you're getting that done to you 24/7, I'm sorry, you might react pretty poorly. And obviously it's not a good look what happened. And I feel terrible for those people. But if you had that coming into your work every day, you might react differently, too.
All right. Professor Barry Friedman, who's also the director of the Policing Project at New York University School of Law. Professor?
Yeah, look, the caller's right in the sense that nobody has a right to impede law enforcement doing what they're supposed to be doing. And there are ways that law enforcement can respond to that, including, arresting people. But at the same time, I think we're looking at a situation where, unfortunately, the federal officials are very poorly trained. I had another op-ed with Brendan Del Pozo, who had been a police chief, about how poor the training's been here. And they're just not equipped to do the job. In an ideal situation, and the caller's right, nobody should have to endure having things thrown at them and some of what's going on. But police are trained to deal with those situations. And what we're seeing here is that the officers aren't trained and they're acting very badly. Dan, I just want to point out, because this is really interesting, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which is, not a left organization by any measure whatsoever. They're very conservative. They've been calling on the White House to convene a gathering to bring the federal and state and local police officials together, because I think they're embarrassed and they're worried for what this is doing to the reputation of policing generally. That's the point you were making yesterday, which is this reflects very badly on policing when a lot of agencies in this country have done a lot to improve the quality of their policing over the last few decades.
And the other thing, Joe, that I would say is that, again, this is a point I made before, there is a different obligation when you have the power of the badge or you have the power of the government behind you. You have additional there are things you can do that a citizen can't do, right? You can go up to people, you can question, you can investigate, you can, in certain cases, knock on doors, whether you need a warrant, et cetera, with a separate issue. But you have powers that individual citizens don't have. But you also have obligations that individual citizens don't have. And as a result, you can't just compare, these hooligans are doing this, and therefore that's comparable to the federal government and federal agents doing that in return. It's the same thing with police. Police are trained to deal with crowd control. And a lot of the time when they're there, it sucks. It sucks for the officers. It's terrible being assigned to that stuff. You're getting yelled at. You're getting spit on sometimes. You're getting insulted. You're pushing back. A lot of them are getting injured. It sucks. But you have specific training in place that the response is not to shoot people. There are rules in place. For example, people say to me on my live police show all the time, well, why don't people shoot out the tires? Why don't the cops shoot out the tires of the fleeing vehicle? And the answer is there's a reason that that's not permitted. It's dangerous. It's not effective. It can lead to more people getting hurt. There's all these reasons because it seems so obvious. Oh, well, not just shoot out the tires, right? But it's not that simple. And there are specific rules and training in place for that specific reason. Eric is in Minnesota. Eric, how you doing? What do you got?
I'm doing great. Thank you. I'm calling in reference to a comment you made to a prior caller when you said there was no nuance when comparing the lives that were taken by illegal aliens in our country versus these DHS officers And I wanted to get your opinion as to whether or not the government had some responsibility, at least in as far as those illegal aliens who had been arrested, had been found to have active deportation orders, and they elected to send them back out onto the street without communicating with ICE and helping get the patient deported.
I mean,
Don't
look,
you believe
my
that
personal
official?
look, right. My personal opinion is in the scenario that you just laid out, if that's happening, then I think that shouldn't be happening. Now, that may be the policy in certain cities. I happen to disagree with it in the fact pattern as you lay it out, right? Which is that someone has been convicted of a crime and they're here illegally, and the city has a policy that says that they can't have any coordination with ICE. I think that's a big problem. But, you know, the notion that is somehow comparable, that is an indirect. So you're saying person gets back on the streets, right? Said person, and it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And when it happens, we hear about it. Said person then engages in another crime. That's not a direct crime by the government. That is you could call it a crime of omission. You can call it, look, judges in this country make bad calls all the time. For example, domestic violence victim comes into court, says, please make sure you issue a restraining order to prevent this guy from getting out. The judge makes a bad call. And I've been very critical of judges who've done this because it's led to women getting killed. But when that happens, that's not the government acting. That's almost inaction by the government. I don't know. Professor Barry Friedman, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, two thoughts. First, the simple one is, look, whether you agree or disagree with the current administration's immigration policy, with enforcement at state or local levels when they've just got somebody in court, we all should be able to agree on the fact that the government can't run wild violating constitutional rights, and we need to do something to get that in check. And then the other point is, I agree with you in part about this government inaction. I mean, the Supreme Court has basically said that is inaction and you can't do anything about it. I would push back on that because when the government's made a commitment, for example, to somebody in child protective services or a domestic violence situation to protect that person, and then they fail, I actually think that we ought to have some accountability because that's the only way government's going to get better. But in general, I think.
So what do you think should happen to a judge? You think a judge should get what? What should happen to a judge who makes a terrible call, which has happened too many
judges
times?
Are tough. They actually, we were talking earlier about absolute immunity. They're one of the few actors that have absolute immunity.
Except for impeachment. Yeah.
In criminal charges, if they, we've had cases like that too. Yeah.
Let's go to Tom in Texas. Tom, how you doing? What's going on?
Hey, Dan, how you doing?
Good, thanks.
Okay, so let me first start off. I told you, guy, I had a bone to pick with you because I called, I believe it was like 3 weeks ago, even before the the Good shooting happened, and I said the problem is not just the good cops, not just the bad cops, but it's the good cops that won't say anything or the good cops that won't step forward. And you kind of brushed me off. And then the good thing happened, and there we go with Kristi Noem and all the others trying to protect cops. It's not just
Kristi Noem. No. These are two separate issues. You want to talk to me about fellow officers who are helping to cover up for something an officer did? Okay, we can have that discussion. That is a completely different issue than Kristi Noem just lying and getting up there and just spouting off. She is not, she's not even, she's not a cop. But more importantly, that's not comparable to the conversation we're having. But you want to make another point, I know. So go ahead. You've taken your hit at me. I've responded. Now you can ask your question.
Yeah. Okay. So my point is, I know Kristi Noem is not a cop, but it's the point of trying to protect your own, whether she's a cop or not. It doesn't matter. She got on live TV. J.D. Vance got on live. The other guy that, whatever his name is, that's supposed to be overhead of Border Patrol, they all did the same thing. And there are cops that do that. And your response to me at that time was, well, there are cops that go and testify. And I understand that they do. Sometimes you ain't got no choice when it's on video. But there are plenty of instances where there's not video and cops cover up for each other. And that's my point.
Okay.
It's not just them, it's the whole thing. So my point is...
Whoa. No. Wait. No. Everything you said up to the end part was okay. And then in the end part, you're like, and this is all that ever happens. And you're sort of like jumbling it all together. I'm okay if you want to give me specific examples, and there are plenty of them to discuss, right? Where police officers covered for other officers. And by the way, in the new world we live in, there has been much more accountability for those police officers than there was, for example, 20 years ago, for cops who covered for other cops. Does it still happen? Yes. But you're suggesting it happens all the time, and as a result, that there's no way that we can get real investigations. And I'm telling you that the vast majority of good police departments in this country now have good, decent to good internal affairs departments, and the ones that don't are tending to get caught, and they're tending to get called out. Does that mean that every police department is effective? No. But I'm just telling you that there has been a vast improvement on this issue in the last 20 years in this country. Go ahead. Final word, Tom.
Okay. I don't dispute that, Dan. I'm not saying you're not right about that. My point was there has to be more. There has to be more. That's all I'm saying.
All right.
I get what you're saying, but that's
all right. Thank you. Appreciate it, Tom. Let's go to Michigan and Andy. Andy, how you doing? What's going on?
Doing well. Thanks for taking my call. Hey, after the good shooting, the argument was that only one officer had pulled his weapon. So how big of a threat could her vehicle have been? With this one, it looks like all four officers that were on top of him shot him. Does that go to their defense that this guy really was that big of a threat, that all the officers had to shoot this guy point blank in the back as they were on top of him?
I'll let Professor Barry Friedman start. It's sort of a setup, but go ahead. I just mean in terms of look, there's no one who's right now saying that, oh, yeah, no, these guys all have a great defense here. I mean, the real defense, Professor Friedman, that I've heard is, well, what if the guy was actually grabbing towards his waistband, right? And that's what they saw. And the officer who shot him the first time didn't realize that he'd been disarmed. That's the best of the defenses that I've seen. Professor Barry Friedman.
Yeah, I mean, I want to go in a slightly different direction with this, which is just to say this is the kind of thing that police chiefs look at and just cover their eyes or gasp, because it's just horrible training going on. I mean, what you've got is a bunch of people who are scared and not up to doing their job, and they're just overreacting in the most tragic of imaginable ways. And this is what happens when you throw lots of officers on the street that are not trained to do the job that they're doing. Tragedy is what happens. And that is why it is so critical for them to know that they can be held responsible. I'll also just point out the Supreme Court said in a case not long ago that I actually participated in, that, you know, when you look at a shooting or something like this and you're looking at the officer's conduct, you don't just look at the moment that they shot. That now you can look back and say, why did they end up in that situation? And in so many of these videos that we've been seeing, that's the right question, which is, why are they in this situation in the first place?
Thank you, Andy. Let's go to California and Gary. Gary, how you doing? What's going on?
Well, I have a question for both of you. You know, I see this as a bigger problem than just bad cops, and they definitely get to be held accountable. But I'm hearing stuff about the Purdy one where some of the cops made like boo-hoo comments after someone confronted them about shooting. I don't know if that's a fact yet, but we do know that the shooter of good said effing the B word. And, you know, I think this is a bigger problem, and I'd like to be able to go after the rage machine that I think is brainwashing those untrained guys, or even trained guys. The other guy had 10 years. I think they're getting, not brainwashed, but they're conditioned that any protester is evil and that they deserve what they're getting. And can police chiefs group together in some sort of class action against the voices that are spurring this on? Anyway, that's I'd like you guys' opinion.
Yeah, well, when you start talking about class actions against people for saying things, it gets a little tricky. Professor Friedman, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I go in a slightly different direction, which is I do think that the officers on the street have been amped up and fed some misdirection that's really had tragic consequences. I'll give you another example that we should be talking about, which was this memo where basically they were told that they could burst into people's homes with an administrative warrant that somebody was in the country unlawfully. Now, that's just unconstitutional. It's just unconstitutional. And the folks that wrote that memo could be held liable. And so I'm just going to keep saying it over and over and over again until there are consequences for doing things that are unlawful and that are unconstitutional. They're just going to keep happening. And, unfortunately and tragically, we all have seen something happen in front of our eyes that we were then told wasn't true, and people are waking up to it. Now's the moment to take action. And what Steve Vladeck and I urged was that every state and local prosecutor where ICE is operating open up a portal for people to send their videos and send their evidence that those officers are acting unconstitutionally. Then they should weed through them and figure out which are actionable.
Joe's in Georgia. Joe, what do you got?
Well, basically that this is a sad situation of lack of training, lack of leadership and direction, and protocols. ICE should not be
Break by 53 latest.
To be urban police, and they aren't police. They're not policing. Police have a relationship with the community, and that establishes norms, whether they be protocols or regulations and common conduct. It's an antithesis and a recipe for bad things to happen, which we're seeing. And the old Vietnamese saying, the fish rots from the head down. When you set up political rhetoric that instills this kind of behavior into the officers as an expectation, that's what they manifest.
All right, Joe, thank you. Professor Barry Friedman, professor of law at New York University Law School, who is the co-author of an article in the New York Times called Local Prosecution is the Answer to Federal Lawlessness. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program. Appreciate it.
Been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Brian from Georgia. Brian, how you doing? What's going on?
Hey, what's up, Dan? I was curious your opinion about the recruiting techniques that we're seeing for ICE. I don't know if you've read about it. I assume you have since you own Mediate, but they're really pulling from phraseology and images from actual SS propaganda and white nationalist propaganda. What do we expect that's going to do to this force? I don't see them as the same as typical police, and I am very pro-police as well, but this just strikes me very, very different because they're pulling from a whole field of different people that are not trained.
Yeah. I mean, look, the level of training that they're getting is not what any decent police department would be offering. The way that they're finding these people, at least the more recent ones, is concerning. But let me be also clear. I am not going to be one of these people who's just going to say ICE is bad, because I don't think ICE is bad. I think that ICE is an important and necessary entity. And I think that still the majority of people who work for the entity are good folks. But there are too many. This is not just like a police department where there's a bad apple. I think we're seeing more than that with regard to ICE. And in part, that's because of the recruiting. And in part, that's because of the lack of accountability. And in part, that's because of what they're being told to do. Remember, they are out there following directions. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.